It was the kind of place nobody talked about openly, an estate overgrown and swallowed by nature, hidden behind the veil of twisted, ancient trees. Locals whispered its name with fear in their voices. The Forbidden Garden. The land, cursed and forgotten, once belonged to the Braxton family, wealthy landowners who had mysteriously vanished generations ago. What remained was a sprawling, decayed mansion at the heart of a garden that seemed to have a life of its own. Rumor had it, those who entered the garden never returned. The thick iron gate guarding the property had rusted over time, but its spikes still stood tall and jagged, like the fangs of a beast waiting for its next victim. Overgrown vines curled around its bars, slithering like serpents, as though protecting the land from unwanted intruders. The air surrounding the estate was heavy, stagnant, carrying the scent of rot and damp earth, a pungent reminder that something far worse than nature thrived there. A group of friends, young adults in their early 20s, had heard the tales but didn't believe them, at least not entirely. One drunken night, as courage mixed with their reckless curiosity, they dared each other to explore the forbidden grounds. Alex, the ringleader, was first to climb the fence, his foot slipping into a thick patch of mud as he landed on the other side. "You scared yet?" Alex sneered, his voice shaking just enough to betray him. Behind him, the others followed. Mia, nervous but unwilling to back down. Jamie, who treated it like a game. And Eric, the quiet one, eyes constantly scanning the tree line for movement. They all knew this was a mistake, but turning back felt cowardly, and none of them wanted to admit they were afraid. The deeper they ventured, the stranger the garden became. The once beautiful roses, tulips, and lilies had mutated into grotesque versions of their former selves. Thorns thick as fingers twisted up their stems, and petals shimmered with an unnatural crimson hue, as though they had been feeding on blood. The air grew colder, and with each step, the group felt like they were being watched. "Do you feel that?" Mia whispered, hugging herself as goosebumps prickled her skin. Her breath fogged in front of her, despite the warm summer night. Alex ignored her, pushing ahead toward the looming mansion in the distance. The once grand structure was now a rotting carcass of wood and stone. Windows were shattered, gaping holes like dark eyes staring into their souls. As they approached, the ground beneath them began to shift, as though the earth itself was alive, writhing beneath their feet. A low growl echoed from the depths of the garden, the sound crawling up their spines like icy fingers. Jamie laughed nervously, trying to shake off the dread that was building in his chest. "Just some animal," he muttered, though he didn't believe it. None of them did. They reached the front door of the mansion, its wooden frame warped and blackened with rot. With a creak that pierced the night, Alex pushed it open. The stench inside was overwhelming: decay, mildew, and something metallic. Blood. They stepped into the dark foyer, the floorboards groaning under their weight. A grand chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals dulled by layers of dust. Torn paintings of long-forgotten family members lined the walls, their eyes gouged out as if someone, or something, had taken pleasure in mutilating them. But it wasn't the mansion that held their attention. Beyond the cracked windows, the garden seemed to pulse with life, dark, malevolent life. The flowers moved, their stems bending and twisting as though reaching out to touch them. The roots writhed under the soil, snaking toward the house, drawn to their presence. "Guys," Eric finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think we should go." Before anyone could respond, a scream shattered the air. Mia, standing near one of the windows, had stumbled back, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. Outside, emerging from the tangled mess of vegetation, was a figure, a woman, or at least what had once been a woman. Her skin was stretched taut over her bones, her face gaunt and hollow, but it was her eyes, black and bottomless, that sent waves of fear crashing over the group. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing teeth that had grown long and sharp, like those of a predatory animal. She's coming for us," Mia stammered, backing away as the figure moved closer to the house. Alex grabbed Mia by the arm, trying to pull her away from the window, but it was too late. The garden had already claimed her. With a sickening crack, the vines burst through the broken glass, wrapping themselves around Mia's legs. They moved unnaturally fast, tightening like constrictors, pulling her towards the window. Her screams filled the room as thorns dug deep into her flesh, blood dripping down her legs, staining the wooden floor. Alex and the others tried to free her, pulling at the vines with all their strength, but they were no match for the garden's power. The roots and tendrils seemed to have a mind of their own, coiling around Mia's body until she was dragged into the garden, her screams abruptly silenced. For a moment, everything was still. Then the growl returned, deeper this time, reverberating through the walls of the house. The garden outside writhed in anticipation, its flowers blooming grotesquely, their petals slick with fresh blood. The group was trapped. They realized now that the garden wasn't just alive, it was hungry. The silence that followed Mia's disappearance was suffocating. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, thicker, as though the mansion itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Alex stood frozen by the window, his knuckles white from gripping the edge of the shattered glass. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing to process what had just happened. But the truth was undeniable. The garden had claimed Mia, swallowed her whole. Eric backed away from the window, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out of here." Asterisk now starred. Jamie, who had been the most cavalier about the whole thing, was no longer laughing. He was staring at the spot where Mia had been pulled into the garden, his face pale and drawn. She's dead," he muttered, his voice hollow. "Mia's dead." Alex snapped back to reality, his survival instincts kicking in. "We don't know that," he said, though his voice trembled. Maybe there's still a chance to save her. We just have to get out of the house and..." But before he could finish, a loud thud echoed from upstairs. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging across the floor, slow and deliberate, as though whatever was moving didn't care about being heard. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the grand staircase that led to the second floor. The chandelier overhead swayed gently, casting flickering shadows across the room. Another thud, followed by the sound of footsteps, slow, uneven, as though something was limping its way toward them. Jamie's voice cracked with fear. "What the hell is that?" Alex motioned for them to stay quiet, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't know, but we can't stay here. We need to move." But before they could make their escape, the dragging sound grew louder, and something appeared at the top of the stairs. At first, it was just a dark shape, barely visible in the dim light. But as it descended, the horror of what they were facing became clear. It was the woman, the same ghastly figure they had seen outside in the garden. Her skin was stretched even tighter over her bones now, like a corpse that had been left to decay for far too long. Her eyes were still black voids, and her mouth was twisted into that same grotesque smile, though now her lips were stained with blood. In her hands, she dragged something heavy behind her, a body, limp and lifeless. It was Mia. Her body was a mangled ruin of torn flesh and bone, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Blood pooled beneath her as the woman dragged her down the stairs, her long fingers wrapped around Mia's ankle like she was nothing more than a broken doll. The group stood paralyzed, their minds struggling to comprehend the nightmare unfolding before them. Jamie let out a choked sob, unable to tear his eyes away from Mia's corpse. Eric took a step back, his hand trembling as he clutched the doorknob, desperate to flee but too terrified to move. The woman stopped halfway down the stairs, her head tilting to the side as she regarded them with those soulless black eyes. Her smile widened, revealing more of her jagged, blood-stained teeth. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice a rasping, inhuman sound that sent shivers down their spines. "The garden is hungry, and it's not done feeding." Before anyone could react, the vines burst through the floorboards, snaking across the room with terrifying speed. They wrapped around Jamie's legs first, yanking him off his feet with such force that his head cracked against the wooden floor. He screamed, thrashing wildly as the thorns dug into his flesh, ripping through his skin like razor wire. Help, please. Jamie's voice was raw with terror, but there was nothing they could do. The vines pulled him across the floor, dragging him toward the shattered window. Alex lunged forward, trying to grab hold of Jamie's arm, but the vines were too strong. They tightened their grip, slicing through muscle and bone, and with a sickening snap, Jamie's arm was torn clean from his body. Blood sprayed across the room, coating the walls and floor in a slick, red sheen. Jamie's screams turned to gurgles as the vines pulled him outside, his body disappearing into the garden's dark embrace. Eric, frozen in horror, finally snapped out of his trance. "We have to go," he shouted, grabbing Alex by the arm and pulling him toward the front door. The two of them ran, their footsteps echoing through the decaying mansion as they fled toward the entrance. But the house had other plans. The door slammed shut in front of them with a deafening bang, the sound reverberating through the walls like a death knell. The vines, now writhing like serpents, began to fill the room, blocking every possible exit. Alex turned to Eric, panic flooding his face. "We're trapped." The woman on the stairs let out a low, guttural laugh, her voice dripping with malice. "You can't escape," she whispered. "The garden wants you." The floor beneath them began to split, cracks forming in the wood as the earth below stirred. The roots, thick and gnarled, pushed their way up through the ground, reaching for the two remaining survivors with insidious intent. Alex and Eric were out of options. The garden was closing in around them, and there was no way out. Alex and Eric stood back to back, their breath ragged and shallow as the vines and roots crept ever closer. The garden's malevolence was palpable now, its hunger a living force, pressing down on them, tightening like a noose. The woman's twisted form hovered on the stairs, watching them with those soulless black eyes, her smile widening as the vines crept nearer. "What does it want?" Eric gasped, his voice barely a whisper. His eyes were wild with terror, darting from the roots, tearing through the floor to the woman, as if she might give him an answer that would save them. "The garden it feeds," the woman crooned, her voice an eerie, raspy hiss. "It needs blood, flesh, life." The vines suddenly surged forward with renewed ferocity, wrapping around Eric's legs before he could move. He screamed, trying to wrench himself free, but the thorns dug deep into his skin, drawing thick rivulets of blood. His eyes widened in horror as the vines pulled tighter, their spiked tendrils slicing deeper into his flesh, coiling like snakes around his torso. "Alex!" Eric screamed, his voice breaking in pure desperation. "Please, don't let it take me." Alex lunged forward, grabbing Eric's arm with all his strength, but the vines were relentless. They pulled harder, ripping through flesh and muscle, blood gushing from the deep wounds. Eric's screams grew more frantic as the vines lifted him off the ground, suspending him in midair, his body twisting as the garden claimed him. With a final, sickening snap, Eric's body was torn apart. His torso ripped in half, blood splattering across Alex's face as his friend's lifeless remains were dragged into the churning mass of roots and vines. The garden devoured him greedily, his blood soaking into the soil, feeding the dark force that controlled it. Alex stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest, while rising in his throat as the reality of the surrounding horror sank in. He was alone now, alone in the mansion, surrounded by a garden that had already claimed 3 of his friends. The woman's laughter echoed through the house, cold and hollow, as if it came from somewhere deep within the earth itself. "You can't run," she whispered, her voice a low, mocking hum. "It will have you too." The vines closed in on him, circling like predators. Alex backed up until he hit the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold fingers of panic gripped him, squeezing the life out of his courage. But in the depths of his terror, he felt a flicker of defiance. He wasn't going to die like this, not here, not like the others. With a surge of adrenaline, Alex bolted toward the grand staircase. The woman's skeletal figure reached for him as he passed, her fingers brushing his arm, but he managed to dodge her grasp. He ran up the stairs 2 at a time, his only thought to get higher, away from the grasping vines below. But the mansion itself seemed to be against him. Every step groaned. The walls shuddered as if they were alive, and the air was thick with the scent of rot and decay. He burst into an upstairs hallway, long and narrow, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. A large window at the far end offered a glimpse of the night sky, but it was cracked and covered in grime, as though the outside world had forgotten this place existed. Behind him, the sound of the vines tearing through the walls grew louder, the roots slithering like snakes, hunting him. He had only one chance. Alex sprinted toward the window, heart pounding, and without hesitation, hurled his body through it. Glass shattered around him, cutting into his skin as he tumbled through the air. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his side as he rolled across the overgrown lawn. Dazed and bleeding, Alex forced himself to his feet. The garden stretched out before him, dark and pulsating, the vines already moving toward him, hungry for his blood. The mansion loomed behind him, its windows like hollow eyes, watching, waiting. But he was free, at least for the moment. He stumbled through the garden, every step a battle against the earth itself as the roots reached up to trip him. The vines slithered at his heels. His vision blurred from pain and exhaustion, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Up ahead, through the twisted trees, he saw the iron gate, the exit. Salvation. With the last of his strength, Alex sprinted toward it, his breath ragged, his legs screaming in protest. The vines were almost upon him now, but he was faster. He reached the gate, his hands grasping the cold iron bars, and with a grunt of effort, he threw the gate open and stumbled through. The moment his feet touched the road outside the gate, the vines stopped. The garden seemed to recoil, as if some invisible force had drawn a line that it could not cross. The tendrils hovered just beyond the gate, twitching, but unable to follow him any further. Alex collapsed onto the road, his body trembling, his mind reeling from the terror of what he had just escaped. His breath came in ragged sobs, his hands shaking as blood dripped from the cuts and gashes that covered him. The mansion loomed behind the gate, silent and still, but Alex knew it wasn't over. The garden was still alive, still waiting, still hungry, and it would never stop, not until it had claimed every last drop of blood from those foolish enough to enter its cursed grounds. Alex stared up at the night sky, his body broken, his mind shattered. He had survived the Forbidden Garden, but at what cost? Somewhere in the distance, the wind carried the faint sound of the woman's laughter. She knew. The garden always knew, and it was always waiting for its next victim.